The rain had not stopped since morning. It fell in a relentless, sighing sheet against the carriage windows, blurring the rolling greens of the countryside into a watercolor wash of emerald and gray. Elara watched the drops chase one another down the glass, each one a tiny, distorted world reflecting the somber sky. Inside, the carriage smelled of damp wool, Beatrice's cloying rosewater perfume, and the faint, acidic tang of Elara's own anxieties. She kept her hands folded tightly in her lap, the worn fabric of her gray traveling dress, a familiar grounding texture beneath her fingertips. Across from her, Lady Beatrice sighed for what must have been the 10th time in as many minutes, her breath fogging a small patch on the window before she wiped it away with a gloved finger. Her pout was a practiced, artful thing, honed over years of getting precisely what she wanted. At present, she wanted the rain to stop, the roads to be less muddy, and the journey to be over. "It is simply dreadful," Beatrice announced to the carriage at large, which consisted only of Elara. "To arrive looking like a drowned rat. The Duke will think we are savages from the wildlands." Elara offered a quiet, non-committal sound. Her role was not to solve Beatrice's problems, but to absorb them, to act as a silent, absorbent surface for her cousin's frequent and varied dissatisfactions. She was not truly a cousin, of course. The connection was distant, a thread of shared blood so thin as to be nearly invisible, but it was enough for Beatrice's father, a man of booming pronouncements and dwindling finances, to install Elara as his daughter's companion. It was a position with no title, little pay, and the constant, draining obligation of being perpetually agreeable. "And this Duke of Blackwood," Beatrice continued, shifting in her seat, the rustle of her silk skirts a sharp sound in the rhythmic drumming of the rain. "They say he is a complete recluse, that he has not been seen in London for 3 seasons. What if he is mad, or horribly disfigured?" Elara's own knowledge of the Duke was limited to the same whispers and rumors Beatrice had devoured. Alistair, Duke of Blackwood, a man who had inherited his title under tragic circumstances, his elder brother having died in a senseless duel. A man who had retreated from society, burying himself in his crumbling ancestral home, an estate said to be as vast and melancholic as its master. He was in need of a fortune, and Beatrice's dowry, while not inexhaustible, was substantial. A match was being engineered. This visit was the first move in a game of familial chess, and Elara, as always, was merely a pawn. "I am certain he is a fine gentleman, Beatrice," she murmured, her gaze returning to the window. The carriage was slowing, turning off the main road onto a private drive. Enormous, ancient oaks, their branches heavy with moss and rain, formed a canopy overhead, plunging them into a deeper twilight. The air grew still, the sound of the rain softening as it was caught by the dense leaves. Blackwood Manor did not appear so much as it loomed. It was a great brooding beast of a house, built of dark stone that seemed to drink the gray light from the sky. Ivy crept up its walls in thick, skeletal fingers, and its many windows stared out like vacant eyes over the sodden landscape. It was not a welcoming sight. It was a fortress of solitude, a monument to grief. Beatrice let out a small, horrified gasp. "Good heavens! It is a tomb." Elara felt a strange, contrary stirring in her chest. While Beatrice saw only gloom, Elara saw a kind of stark, mournful beauty. She saw the clean, strong lines of the architecture beneath the decay. She saw the resilience of the ivy. She saw a place that was not pretending to be something it was not. It was a house that wore its sorrow openly, and for that she felt an odd, immediate respect. The carriage rattled to a stop on the graveled drive. A footman, his livery immaculate despite the weather, opened the door, a large black umbrella held aloft. The air that rushed in was cool and smelled of wet earth, of stone, and of the clean, sharp scent of pine from the distant woods. It was a relief after the stale air of the carriage. As Beatrice gathered her skirts and prepared to make her grand, if slightly dampened entrance, Elara took a moment. She looked at the house, at its formidable, unsmiling face. She was here to be invisible, to stand behind Beatrice's shoulder, to nod and to fetch, and to be forgotten. It was a role she had perfected, But as she stepped out of the carriage and felt the fine mist on her face, a premonition settled over her, as quiet and persistent as the rain. This place, for all its sorrow, was different. This place would change things. The great hall of Blackwood Manor was a cavern of shadows and silence. A fire roared in a hearth, large enough to roast an ox, but its light seemed to be swallowed by the sheer scale of the room, by the dark wood paneling that climbed to a vaulted ceiling lost in gloom. The only other sources of light were tall, narrow windows that admitted the weak, gray afternoon light, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, restless spirits. The sound of their footsteps echoed on the flagstone floor, a small, intrusive noise in the profound quiet. An elderly housekeeper, her spine as straight and unyielding as the house itself, greeted them with a stiff, formal curtsy. Her name was Mistress Hobbs, and her face was a roadmap of years spent in loyal, cheerless service. She informed them that His Grace was occupied. He would receive them at dinner. They were to be shown to their rooms. Beatrice bristled at the slight, her lips tightening. To be welcomed by a servant, not the Duke himself, was a breach of etiquette she would not soon forget. But Ilara felt a sense of reprieve. The Duke's absence meant a few more hours of invisibility, a chance to settle into the rhythm of the house before the performance had to begin. Her room was not a guest chamber, but a smaller room tucked away at the end of a long, winding corridor, likely intended for a lady's maid. It was simple, furnished with a narrow bed, a sturdy wardrobe, and a small writing desk. But its single window looked out not over the imposing front drive, but over a walled garden. Even in the rain, she could see the ghost of its structure. The neat, geometric beds, the espaliered fruit trees pressed flat against the stone walls, the stone bench nestled in an alcove. It was a place of order and quiet contemplation, and her heart eased. She spent the afternoon unpacking her few belongings, her movements precise and economical. She laid out her 2 other dresses, both in sensible shades of brown and blue. She arranged her brushes on the small vanity. Lastly, she unwrapped a small, leather-bound book and a set of drafting pens from their oilcloth protection. These were her secret treasures, the tools of her private passion. Since childhood, she had loved the certainty of maps, the way they made sense of the world, translating messy, sprawling landscapes into clean lines and elegant script. It was a comfort, this imposition of order on chaos. Dinner was a strained, awkward affair. The dining room was as vast and shadowy as the great hall, the long, polished table reflecting the flickering candlelight like a dark, still lake. They were 3 small figures lost in its expanse. Beatrice, radiant in a gown of sapphire silk, her chatter unnaturally bright in the oppressive silence. Ilara, a study in gray, her presence as muted as she could make it. And the Duke. He had entered the room without a sound, a tall, broad-shouldered man who seemed to carry the shadows with him. He was not mad, nor was he disfigured. He was, Ilara noted with a detached, analytical part of her mind, strikingly handsome, with a strong jaw, dark, unruly hair, and eyes the color of a stormy sea. But it was a beauty hollowed out by something, grief, or perhaps just a profound weariness. He moved like a man carrying an invisible weight. He greeted Beatrice with a cool, formal nod, his gaze sweeping over her, and then over Ilara, with an unnerving lack of distinction. It was as if he were looking at 2 pieces of furniture that had been inconveniently placed in his line of sight. Throughout the meal, he said little, responding to Beatrice's breathless anecdotes with monosyllabic grunts, his attention fixed on a point somewhere beyond the mullioned windows. Ilara observed him. It was what she did best. She noted the way his hand, large and capable, rested on the stem of his wineglass but rarely lifted it. She noted the fine lines of strain around his eyes. She saw a man not of arrogance, but of deep, abiding exhaustion. He was not a monster. He was a man trapped in a cage of his own making, and this house was his willing warden. Beatrice, failing to capture his interest with tales of London society, grew increasingly frustrated. Her voice became shriller, her laughter more brittle. She was a vibrant, colorful bird dashing herself against the bars of a cage, and the Duke did not even seem to notice. After the meal, which Alara could not have said she tasted, they retired to a small, slightly less intimidating drawing room. Beatrice, determined to showcase her accomplishments, moved to the pianoforte. She played with technical skill but little feeling, each note a bright, hard gem dropped into the silence. The Duke stood by the fireplace, one arm resting on the mantel, his profile etched by the firelight. He did not seem to be listening. His gaze was distant, lost in the flames. Alara, seated in a high-backed chair in the corner, felt a strange compulsion. She wanted to understand the geometry of his sorrow, to map the terrain of his isolation. It was on the third day that the initial encounter happened, not in a drawing room or at the dinner table, but in a place she was not supposed to be. Restless with the forced idleness, Alara had taken to exploring the house. The main corridors were a public highway, but the servant passages were a secret map, a network of quiet, dusty pathways that allowed her to move through the house unseen. One such passage led her to a wing she had not yet explored. Following a faint line of light under a door, she found herself pushing it open a crack. The room beyond was a study, or perhaps an office. It was a space of controlled chaos. Books were piled on every surface, scrolls of paper were tied with ribbon and stacked in corners, and a massive oak desk stood in the center, buried under a mountain of ledgers and documents. And at the desk sat the Duke. He was not the cold, distant host from dinner. He was bent over a ledger, his dark hair falling across his forehead, his brow furrowed in concentration. One hand was tangled in his hair, the other gripped a pen, a smudge of ink on his knuckle. He wore no formal coat, just a simple white shirt, the sleeves rolled to his elbows, revealing strong forearms. The firelight cast a warm golden glow on the scene, a stark contrast to the cool grays and blues of the rest of the house. Here, in this room, was where the life of the manor was, the beating heart of it. She should have retreated, closed the door silently, and slipped away. It was a private moment, and she was an intruder. But she was frozen, captivated by the image. This was not the Duke of Blackwood. This was Alistair, a man wrestling with numbers, a man trying to hold his world together with ink and paper. He let out a low, frustrated sigh and pushed the ledger away, rubbing his eyes with the heels of his hands. It was a gesture of pure, unadulterated weariness, and it resonated with something deep inside her. For the first time, she saw him not as a title, but as a person. Without thinking, her eyes scanned the open ledger, her mind automatically seeking the pattern in the columns of figures. Even upside down and from a distance, she could see it. A simple error in calculation, a misplaced decimal point, carried over from one column to the next, throwing off the entire balance. It was a small mistake, but one that would have significant consequences, compounding with each subsequent entry. He looked up then, his storm-gray eyes catching hers through the crack in the door. She expected a flash of anger, an imperious command to leave. Instead, there was just surprise, followed by a deeper shade of weariness. He did not seem to have the energy for anger. "Can I help you, mistress?" He trailed off, not knowing her name. She felt a flush of heat creep up her neck. She had been caught, but the habit of competence was stronger than the instinct for retreat. Her voice was quiet, but steady. "Alara, my name is Alara Vance." She pushed the door open a little further. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I was lost." "Everyone is lost in this house," he said, his voice a low rumble. He did not ask her to leave. He simply watched her, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched. She should have curtsied and fled. Instead, she took a single, hesitant step into the room. The smell of old paper, leather, and wood smoke was intoxicating. It smelled of work, of purpose. "The error," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It is in the third column, the tithe from the North Fields. It has been miscalculated." His eyes narrowed. He pulled the ledger back towards him, his long fingers tracing the lines of figures she had indicated. She saw the exact moment he found it. A muscle twitched in his jaw. He looked back up at her, and for the first time, the blanketing fog of exhaustion in his eyes cleared, replaced by a spark of sharp, genuine interest. He was truly seeing her, not as a piece of furniture or as Beatrice's shadow, but as a person who had seen something he had missed. "Show me," he said. It was not a request. It was a command, but one born of curiosity, not authority. And so Elara Vance, the quiet companion, the invisible woman, walked into the Duke of Blackwood's private study and, with a hesitant finger, pointed out the flaw in his world. It was the beginning of their secret. The study became their sanctuary. It started unofficially. The next day, after another tense and largely silent breakfast with Beatrice, Elara found herself drawn back to the West Wing. She told herself she was simply exploring, that her feet had a mind of their own. But she knew where she was going. The door to the study was ajar, a silent invitation. Alistair was there, just as he had been the day before, surrounded by his paper sentinels. He looked up as she entered, and this time, there was no surprise in his eyes, only a quiet expectation. He gestured to the chair opposite his desk. It was a simple movement, but it felt momentous. It was an acknowledgement of her presence, an acceptance of her into his private world. "I have checked the ledgers going back 5 years," he began, without preamble. "The same error, compounding. We have been overcharging the tenants of the Northfields for half a decade." His voice was flat, but she heard the undercurrent of self-reproach. "It is an easy mistake to make," she offered, her voice soft. "It is a mistake that has cost families money they did not have," he countered, his gaze sharp. "It is a mistake I should have caught." He leaned back in his chair, the leather groaning in protest. "My father, he was a man of grand gestures. Balls, hunts, London seasons. He was not a man for details. I have been trying to unravel the mess he left behind ever since I returned." It was the first piece of his personal history he had offered, a small, cracked tile in the mosaic of his grief. She did not press, did not offer empty platitudes. Instead, she reached for the ledger he had pushed across the desk. "May I?" He nodded, and so they began. For hours they worked in a comfortable, companionable silence, broken only by the scratch of her pen, the rustle of paper, and the occasional low-voiced question. He would explain the history of a particular parcel of land, the families who worked it, the challenges they faced with drainage or soil quality. She, in turn, would listen, her mind translating his words into the clean, logical language of numbers and lines. She was not just correcting his math, she was mapping his world, giving it a structure and clarity it had lacked. She discovered he was not just a weary nobleman, he was a man with a deep, almost paternalistic sense of duty to his land and his people. He knew the names of his tenants, the number of their children, the state of their roofs. The weight he carried was not just the title, but the responsibility for thousands of lives that depended on the prosperity of the estate. The ledgers were not just numbers to him, they were people. He, in turn, discovered that she was more than just a quiet woman in a gray dress. He saw the quickness of her mind, the elegant precision of her thoughts. He would watch, fascinated, as she drew a quick, clear diagram to explain a complex system of crop rotation or water rights. She thought in pictures and patterns, and she had an innate understanding of systems that he, for all his education, lacked. She was not just seeing the numbers, she was seeing the story they told. These hours in the study became the anchor of Elara's days. Beatrice would spend her mornings abed, her afternoons preening and preparing for the evening's ordeal of dining with their silent host. She complained endlessly about Elara's disappearances, accusing her of shirking her duties. But Elara found she no longer cared. For the first time in years, she felt not just useful, but seen. One late afternoon, the fire had burned low, and the room was filled with the soft blue light of encroaching dusk. They were bent over a large, brittle map of the estate, its edges crumbling, its ink faded. Alistair was pointing out a disputed boundary with a neighboring landowner, his voice a low murmur in the quiet room. "The old stream used to run here," he said, his finger tracing a faint blue line that was barely visible. "But it changed course after the Great Flood 30 years ago. Lord Ashworth claims the land to the new bank, but our deeds show the boundary as the old course." Elara leaned closer, her hair brushing his sleeve. The scent of him, clean linen, old paper, and something uniquely masculine, like sandalwood and winter air, filled her senses. Her heart gave a strange, unfamiliar flutter. She ignored it, focusing on the map. "The deed is the legal document," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "But a survey would be required to prove the location of the old streambed. The contours here suggest a natural depression." Her own finger moved to the map, tracing the faint topographic lines. As she drew back her hand, he reached out, not to the map, but to her. He meant to steady a rolling scroll of paper, but his hand closed over hers where it rested on the desk. The touch was electric. A jolt, sharp and startling, shot up her arm. It was a simple, unintentional contact, a brief meeting of flesh and bone, but it shattered the quiet, professional bubble they had built around themselves. The room, which had been a haven of intellectual companionship, was suddenly charged with a different, more volatile energy. His skin was warm, his hand large and calloused, enveloping hers completely. She could feel the faint, steady rhythm of his pulse against her own. She looked up, and her breath caught in her throat. He was already looking at her, his stormy eyes dark and intense. The weariness was gone, the intellectual curiosity was gone. In its place was something raw and unguarded, something she had never seen in him before. It was a look of profound, startling recognition, as if he were seeing her for the very first time, and at the same time, as if he had known her forever. He pulled his hand back as if he had been burned, the suddenness of the movement a confession in itself. The air between them crackled with the unspoken. The silence that fell was not the comfortable silence of before. It was a new kind of silence, heavy with questions they were both afraid to ask. "I should," she began, her voice a little breathless. "Beatrice will be wondering where I am." It was a flimsy excuse, and they both knew it. "Yes," he said, his voice hoarse. He did not look at her. He stared at the map as if it held the answers to a different, more complicated boundary dispute. She fled. She walked, quickly and quietly, from the room, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She did not stop until she was back in the safety of her own small room, the one that overlooked the quiet, orderly garden. But the garden no longer seemed peaceful. The neat beds and straight lines felt like a mockery of the chaotic, disorderly feeling that had taken root in her own heart. She pressed her hand, the one he had touched, to her chest, as if to still its wild beating. The warmth of his skin still lingered on hers, a phantom touch that promised nothing but complications. The secret of the study was no longer just about numbers and maps. It now held a new secret, one that was far more dangerous. The weeks that followed were a delicate, nerve-wracking dance. The unspoken moment in the study had changed the very air between them. Their meetings continued, for the work was too important, too engrossing to abandon. The estate, under their joint clandestine management, was slowly beginning to breathe again. Debts were being restructured, inefficient practices were being reformed, and a plan for repayment to the Northfield's tenants was being drafted. But the easy companionship had been replaced by a taut awareness. Every accidental brush of hands as they passed a document, every time their eyes met over the top of a ledger, the memory of that charged silence hung between them. Alara found herself cataloging the details of his presence, the way a stray lock of hair fell across his brow when he was deep in thought, the low, rumbling timbre of his voice when he was explaining a point of law, the rare, fleeting smile that would touch his lips when she pointed out a particularly clever solution to a problem. It was a smile that transformed his whole face, chasing the shadows from his eyes and revealing a glimpse of the man he might have been, the man he could still be. He, for his part, seemed to be engaged in a similar, silent study of her. She would look up from her work to find him watching her, his expression a mixture of fascination and a kind of pained confusion. He had invited her into his world of numbers, but he had not anticipated that she would inhabit it so completely, that she would become so essential to its functioning. He had sought a competent assistant. He had found a partner, and that partnership was beginning to bleed from the professional into the personal, a transgression of social boundaries he was clearly struggling to navigate. Meanwhile, outside the sanctuary of the study, the rest of the world continued its inexorable march. Beatrice's campaign to capture the Duke's affections had stalled completely. Her pretty accomplishments and vapid chatter were met with the same polite, impenetrable wall of indifference. Her frustration began to curdle into suspicion, and her sharp, jealous eyes began to follow Ilara. "You spend a great deal of time wandering the halls, cousin," she remarked one afternoon, her voice dripping with false sweetness as Ilara entered the drawing room. "One might think you were casing the house for valuables." "I enjoy the quiet, Beatrice," Ilara replied calmly, taking up her sewing basket. It had become her shield, a prop to suggest domestic placidity. "The Duke seems to enjoy the quiet as well," Beatrice mused, tapping a finger against her lips. "Perhaps you have found a common interest." The implication was clear, an arrow loosed with malicious intent. The arrival of Beatrice's brother, Lord Cassian, only served to heighten the tension. Cassian was everything the Duke was not: loud, ostentatiously fashionable, and possessed of a slick, predatory charm that made Ilara's skin crawl. He was the architect of this proposed match, and he had arrived to see why his plans were not proceeding as expected. Cassian was a man who understood the world in terms of power, leverage, and social currency. He took one look at the situation: the brooding, withdrawn Duke, his ambitious but failing sister, and the quiet, watchful companion, and his eyes narrowed. He was a social gatekeeper, a guardian of the rigid hierarchies that governed their world, and he immediately identified Ilara as an anomaly, an unacceptable variable in his carefully constructed equation. His antagonism was not overt at first. It took the form of small, subtle humiliations. He would forget her name, referring to her as the companion, or Beatrice's little shadow. He would interrupt her if she dared to speak, turning to the Duke with a dismissive laugh, as if to say, "Who is listening to her?" He would ask her to fetch things: a shawl for Beatrice, a footstool, a glass of water, in a tone that stripped away her status as a gentlewoman, however distant, and reduced her to a mere servant. Ilara bore it with her customary quiet dignity, her composure a silent rebuke to his cruelty. She knew his type. He was a bully who derived his sense of importance from diminishing others. To react would be to give him the victory he craved. Alistair, to his credit, seemed to notice and disapprove. A muscle would tighten in his jaw when Cassian made a particularly cutting remark. He would pointedly address Ilara by her name, his voice a low counterpoint to Cassian's booming condescension. But he never intervened directly. The drawing room was society's battlefield, and its rules were not the clear, logical rules of his study. Here, he was still the withdrawn Duke, a spectator in his own home. His defense of her was private, confined to the sympathetic glances he would send her way when he thought no one was looking. They were small, silent gestures of solidarity, but they were not enough to shield her from the storm that was gathering. The catalyst, when it came, was a grand ball. In a desperate, last-ditch effort to re-engage the Duke and impress the county, Beatrice, with Cassian's enthusiastic support, had convinced him to host a ball. Alistair had agreed with a weary resignation, as if consenting to a necessary but unpleasant medical procedure. The house, for the first time since their arrival, stirred with a frantic, alien energy. Servants scurried, dusting chandeliers and polishing silver. Flowers arrived by the cartload. An orchestra was hired from the city. Ilara felt a sense of dread descend. The ball was a public stage, and she knew, with a chilling certainty, that Cassian intended to use it. The quiet, ordered world of the study felt a million miles away, a dream she was about to wake from. On the night of the ball, she dressed in her best gown, a simple dress of deep blue velvet that she had made herself. It was unadorned, without the lace and ribbons that decorated Beatrice's confection of pink satin, but the color brought out the gray of her eyes, and the fabric fell in clean, elegant lines. She felt a quiet confidence in its simplicity. The ballroom was a blaze of light and sound. Hundreds of candles glittered in the chandeliers, reflecting off the polished floor and the jewels of the assembled guests. The air was thick with perfume and the buzz of conversation. It was a world away from the shadowy, silent house she had come to know. She saw Alistair standing at the head of the receiving line, looking magnificent and utterly miserable in his formal attire. He greeted his guests with a stiff, practiced courtesy, his eyes scanning the crowd with a hunted expression. When his gaze met hers for a fleeting second, she saw a silent plea for rescue. She spent the evening as she always did at such events, hovering near the edges of the room, a ghost at the feast. She watched Beatrice hold court, surrounded by a circle of admirers. She watched Cassian move through the crowd, his smile too bright, his eyes too sharp. Later in the evening, seeking a moment of respite from the noise and the heat, she slipped away. She found herself, as if by instinct, heading towards the West Wing, towards the silence and sanity of the study. She did not expect him to be there, but he was. He was standing by the window, which he had opened to the cool night air, the sounds of the ball a faint, muffled rhythm in the distance. He had discarded his coat and loosened his cravat. He turned as she entered, and a look of profound relief washed over his face. "Ilara," he breathed, her name a balm. "I thought I was going to suffocate in there." "It is rather overwhelming," she agreed, staying by the door. The intimacy of the room felt dangerous tonight, a stark contrast to the public spectacle next door. "All these people," he said, gesturing vaguely in the direction of the music. "They talk and they talk, but they say nothing. They look at this house, at me, and they see a title, an opportunity. They do not see the rot in the foundations, the leaking roof, the mountain of debt." He looked at her, his eyes dark and serious. "You are the only one who has ever bothered to look at the ledgers." "The ledgers are honest," she replied softly. "They do not care for titles." He took a step towards her. "Nor do you." He was closer now, close enough that she could see the flicker of the single candle on the desk reflected in his eyes. The air was thick with all the things they had never said, all the moments of shared understanding that had built up between them, column by column, like the figures in their books. "Alistair," she began, not knowing what she was going to say. And it was at that precise, vulnerable moment that the door was thrown open. Lord Cassian stood on the threshold, his face a mask of triumphant fury. Behind him, framed in the doorway, was Beatrice, her expression a mixture of shock and malicious glee. "Well, well," Cassian said, his voice carrying through the suddenly silent corridor. "What do we have here? A secret meeting?" He strode into the room, his eyes sweeping over the scene, the Duke in his shirt sleeves, Ilara standing in the candlelight, the entire tableau one of damning intimacy. "My sister spends weeks trying to gain a moment of your time, Your Grace," Cassian sneered, his voice loud enough for the curious guests who were now gathering in the hallway to hear. "And all the while, you are hiding in here with her paid companion. How very democratic of you." Alistair stiffened, his face darkening with a thunderous rage. "Cassian, you will leave my study at once." But Cassian was playing to the crowd. He turned to Ilara, his lip curled in contempt. "And you," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "You quiet, mousy little schemer. Did you really think it would work? Did you think your clever act, your feigned interest in his boring books, would land you a duke? You are a charity case, a poor relation living on my family's goodwill. You have nothing. You are nothing." The words were like physical blows. Each one struck home with brutal precision, targeting every insecurity, every fear she had ever harbored about her place in the world. The room began to spin. The faces in the hallway, curious, shocked, pitying, blurred into a horrifying tapestry of public judgment. This was it, the public humiliation she had been dreading. She looked at Alistair. Her entire being screamed for him to speak, to defend her, to deny Cassian's poisonous accusations. She saw the war in his eyes. She saw the Duke, the man of title and property, wrestling with the man who had shared his secrets with her in the quiet of this room. He opened his mouth to speak, but for a fatal, eternal second, he hesitated. And in that second of silence, Ilara's heart broke. It was not the silence of the comfortable companionship they had shared. It was the silence of the chasm between their worlds, a vast, unbridgeable gulf of status and expectation. His hesitation was her answer. In the public square, in the face of his peers, he could not, or would not, choose her. A strange, cold calm settled over her. The spinning stopped. The noise faded. She lifted her chin, her back straightening. She would not give Cassian the satisfaction of her tears. She would not give anyone the satisfaction of her pain. She turned her gaze from Alistair, a deliberate final severing. She looked directly at Lord Cassian, her eyes clear and steady. Then, without a word, she executed a flawless, formal curtsy. It was the curtsy of a servant to a master, a gesture of absolute, soul-crushing propriety. "If you will excuse me," she said, her voice a perfect level whisper that somehow cut through the tension in the room. "I must go and pack my things." She turned and walked out of the study. She did not run. She walked, her head held high, through the parted crowd of whispering guests. They were a sea of silks and jewels, of shocked and scandalized faces, and she moved through them like a ship sailing through wreckage. She did not look back. She did not need to. The image of Alistair's face, frozen in a mask of horrified indecision, was burned into her memory. The greatest noise in the world was the sound of the word he had failed to say. By dawn, she was gone. She left a single, brief note for Beatrice, a formal resignation of her position. She took nothing but her small bag, her drafting tools, and the crushing weight of a future that had, for a few brief weeks, seemed full of impossible promise. The rain had started again, a soft, weeping drizzle, as the mail coach carried her away from Blackwood Manor, away from the man who had seen her so clearly in private, and failed to see her at all in public. The journey back to the city was a blur of gray landscapes and grayer thoughts. Alara sat numbly in the corner of the rattling coach, the world outside the window as indistinct as her own future. The cold calm that had sustained her through her departure from Blackwood had given way to a deep, aching sorrow, a hollow space in her chest where hope had briefly resided. Cassian's words echoed in her mind. A charity case, a poor relation, you have nothing, you are nothing, but they were not what caused the most pain. The true wound was Alistair's silence. It was a silence that had validated every one of Cassian's cruelties, a silence that had confirmed her deepest fear, that in the end, the chasm between their stations was simply too wide to cross. She found a room in a respectable, if threadbare, boarding house for single women, a place that smelled of boiled cabbage and quiet desperation. Her funds were meager, a small inheritance from her mother that she had guarded fiercely, and she knew it would not last long. The first few days were a struggle against despair. She would sit by the window of her small, cramped room, watching the anonymous bustle of the London street below, feeling utterly, terrifyingly alone. But the habit of competence was a deeply ingrained part of her character. She could not, would not, allow herself to dissolve into self-pity. She was a survivor. She had a skill. On the fourth day, she unpacked her precious drafting tools and her last few sheets of clean, high-quality paper. She spent her remaining coins on a new bottle of India ink and a city atlas. She began to work. She found a strange solace in the precise, exacting nature of the task. She copied maps, her pen moving with a steady, practiced grace, translating the chaotic sprawl of the city into elegant lines and perfect script. The work focused her mind, pushing aside the painful memories, replacing the turmoil in her heart with the quiet satisfaction of a line well drawn, a curve perfectly rendered. She took her finished samples to a printer of books and atlases, a gruff, ink-stained man who examined her work with a critical eye. He was impressed by the clarity and precision of her hand. He offered her a pittance for each completed map, piecework that would barely keep her fed, but it was a start. It was work. It was purpose. It was hers. Meanwhile, at Blackwood Manor, Alistair was living in his own private hell. The moment Alara had walked out of the study, the spell of his paralysis had broken, replaced by a tidal wave of self-loathing and regret. He had rounded on Cassian with a fury that had shocked even himself, expelling him and his sister from the house with a cold finality that left no room for argument. The ball had ended abruptly, the guests scurrying away like startled mice, leaving him alone in the vast, silent ballroom. He had gone to her room, of course, but it was already empty. The neat, narrow bed was stripped, the wardrobe bare. The only sign that she had ever been there was the faint, lingering scent of lavender and the profound, deafening silence. He was too late. His hesitation, that single, fatal moment of indecision, had cost him everything. The days that followed were the bleakest of his life. The house, which had begun to feel like a home under her quiet influence, reverted to being a tomb. The study, their sanctuary, became a torture chamber. Every ledger, every map, every scrap of paper was a testament to her intelligence, a reminder of what he had lost. He saw her ghost everywhere, in the chair opposite his desk, in the way the afternoon light fell across the floor, in the neat columns of figures she had corrected. He finally understood the depth of his folly. He had spent years trying to be the responsible duke, the man who put duty and title above all else. He had let the weight of his name, the expectations of his class, paralyze him. In his fear of creating a scandal, he had committed a far greater sin, a betrayal of the heart. He had allowed a man like Cassian to define her worth, when he knew, with an unshakable certainty, that her quiet integrity was worth more than all the titles and fortunes in the kingdom. He had to get her back. But how? The Duke of Blackwood in him, the man conditioned by a lifetime of privilege, had an immediate, instinctual answer. He would send for her. He would send an apology. He would send a gift. The first gift arrived a fortnight after her departure. A liveried footman from a London townhouse, clearly belonging to a person of immense wealth, delivered a large, handsomely wrapped box to her boarding house. The landlady, her eyes wide with curiosity, brought it up to Alara's room. It was from him. His name was not on it, but the ducal crest embossed on the wax seal was unmistakable. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She stared at the box, her hands trembling slightly. A part of her, a foolish, hopeful part, wanted to tear it open. But then the memory of his silence, of the public humiliation, rose up, cold and sharp. What could this box possibly contain? An apology? Forgiveness could not be bought or packaged. A jewel? A dress? The thought was insulting, a suggestion that her pain could be assuaged by a pretty trinket. It was a duke's solution to a problem of the heart, an attempt to smooth over a deep wound with the application of wealth. It was a gesture that, once again, emphasized the very distance between them that had caused the problem in the first place. With a heavy heart, she took a sheet of plain paper and wrote a simple, polite note. "I thank your grace, but I cannot accept." She did not open the box. She wrapped it back up in its paper, tied the ribbon, and paid a boy a precious shilling to have it delivered back to the Duke's London residence. Returning it was an act of self-preservation. To accept the gift would be to accept that their relationship was one of patron and supplicant, of duke and dependent. It would be to deny the partnership they had briefly shared. The second gift arrived 3 days later. This one was smaller, a flat package. It was, she guessed, a book. Perhaps the rare volume on ancient cartography they had once discussed. The temptation was immense. This gift was more personal, a sign that he remembered their conversations, that he knew her interests. But the principle remained the same. A book was still a thing. It was not a conversation. It was not an explanation. It was not the presence of the man himself. Again, she wrote the same note. Again, she sent it back, unopened. And so it began, a strange, silent correspondence of gifts and refusals, a set of exquisite drafting tools, their handles inlaid with mother-of-pearl, a warm cashmere shawl against the autumn chill, a portfolio of the finest watercolor paper. Each gift was more thoughtful, more personal than the last, each one a testament to the fact that he had listened, that he had seen her, and each one she returned. The deliveries became a source of gossip in the boarding house. The landlady's curiosity turned to awe, and then to bewilderment. The other residents would whisper as Alara passed on the stairs. Who was this mysterious benefactor who sent such lavish gifts? And who was this strange, stubborn woman who refused them? With each returned package, Alistair's frustration and desperation grew. He paced the floors of his London house, a caged lion. He did not understand. He was offering her beautiful things, useful things, things that showed he knew her. Why did she keep refusing? He was a duke. People did not refuse his gifts. He was trying to apologize in the only way he knew how, the way his station had taught him. He was trying to fix what he had broken. The 10th gift was a deed to a small, charming cottage on the edge of the Blackwood estate, complete with a garden and a small annuity. It was a promise of security, of independence. It was a magnificent, generous gesture. And when it too came back with the same polite, unyielding note, Alistair finally threw the unopened document onto his desk in despair. He was getting it wrong. He was getting it all spectacularly, disastrously wrong. He was still thinking like a duke, trying to solve an emotional crisis with a financial transaction. He was offering her everything: security, comfort, luxury, everything except the one thing that was required, the one thing she was waiting for. He sent 20 gifts in total: a telescope for studying the stars, a collection of pressed flowers from the walled garden at Blackwood, a first-edition copy of Newton's Principia. Each one was a silent, beautifully packaged plea, and each one was met with the same quiet, dignified refusal. The 20th gift was a simple, unadorned box. Inside he had placed a single, perfectly preserved oak leaf from the drive at Blackwood, a symbol of the place where her presence had first felt like a promise of renewal. It was the most personal, most poetic gift of all. When the 20th gift was returned, Alistair did not get angry. He did not despair. A strange, quiet clarity settled over him. He looked at the growing pile of his own returned offerings, a monument to his own foolishness. He had been sending proxies, emissaries of his affection, when she had made it clear from the very beginning that she valued honesty above all else. She was not returning the gifts. She was returning the gesture. She was refusing to let him hide behind his wealth and his title. She was demanding that he show up, that he be accountable, that he risk himself. He finally understood. It was not the gifts she wanted. It was the man who sent them. He could not send a footman on this errand. He had to go himself. The day he came was a Tuesday. The sky was a low, bruised purple, threatening snow. Ilara was in her small room, bent over her drafting table, the light from the window fading fast. She was working on a complex map of the city's parish boundaries, her fingers smudged with ink, her brow furrowed in concentration. The work had become her whole world, a small, orderly refuge from the chaos of her emotions. She had heard the whispers, the awestruck gossip about the 20th returned gift, but she had pushed it from her mind. It was done. It had to be done. There was a knock on her door. It was not the landlady's timid rap, but a firm, solid sound that seemed to vibrate through the thin wood. "Come in," she called out, her voice weary, not looking up from her work. She assumed it was a message from the printer, a new commission or a complaint. The door opened. She did not hear it at first, so engrossed was she in the delicate rendering of a church spire, but a change in the quality of the silence, a sudden stillness in the air, made her look up. He was standing in the doorway. He was not the Duke of Blackwood. He was not wearing fine silks or polished boots. He was dressed in simple, dark traveling clothes, his greatcoat dusted with damp from the threatening snow. His hair was unruly, his face was tired, and he held his hat in his hands like a penitent. He looked large and out of place in her small, spare room, a great oak tree transplanted into a window box. Her pen slipped from her fingers, leaving a black, star-shaped blot on the pristine surface of her map. The ink spread, ruining hours of work. She did not care. She could not breathe. They stared at each other across the small room. The space between them was filled with the weight of 20 unanswered gifts, of one terrible silence, and of countless hours spent in shared, quiet purpose. "Ilara," he said, and his voice was not the commanding tone of a duke, but the raw, unsteady voice of a man who had traveled a long way and was afraid he had come too late. He took a hesitant step into the room, his eyes taking in the scene, the narrow bed, the single chair, the drafting table covered in the evidence of her labor. He saw the ink blot on the ruined map. "I am sorry," he said, his gaze fixed on the black stain. "I have made a mess of your work." The simple, literal apology was so unexpected, so earnest that it broke the spell of her shock. A small, hysterical laugh escaped her lips. "It is not the first time." The corner of his mouth twitched in a sad, self-deprecating smile. "No, it seems to be my specialty." He did not move further into the room. He stood by the door, giving her space, his presence a quiet question. He was not demanding an audience. He was requesting one. "Why are you here, Your Grace?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. She needed to hear it. She needed to know that he understood. "Please," he said, his voice dropping lower. "Do not call me that. Not you. My name is Alistair." He took a deep breath, the kind a man takes before plunging into icy water. "I am here because I have been a fool, a coward, a blind, arrogant fool." He began to speak, and the words came not in a smooth, practiced apology, but in a halting, honest confession. He told her about the ball, about the paralysis that had seized him. He did not make excuses. He explained the weight of his title, the years of conditioning that had taught him to put public face and duty before all else, but he explained it as a weakness, not a justification. "In that moment," he said, his voice thick with shame, "I failed you. I failed myself. I let a man like Cassian, a man whose opinion I despise, dictate my actions. I stood by in silence while he attacked the person I respect more than anyone I have ever known. My silence was a lie, and it has haunted me every second since you left." He looked around the room again, at her maps, at her ink-stained fingers. "So I tried to fix it. I tried to fix it the only way I knew how, with things. I sent you gifts. I thought I could send my apology. I could send my respect. I could send security. I was trying to show you that I saw you, that I valued you, but I was still hiding. I was still sending a proxy, hiding behind my wealth, just as I hid behind my title at the ball." He finally met her eyes, and she saw in their stormy depths a vulnerability she had never seen before. It was the look of a man stripped bare of all his defenses. "You returned every one," he said, a note of wonder in his voice. "You refused the jewels, the books, the deed. You refused to be bought. You refused to be managed. You demanded me. My presence, my own apology, spoken from my own mouth." He took another step closer, his hands clenching and unclenching on the brim of his hat. "I am not here to offer you a gift, Alara. I have nothing in my hands. I am here to ask for one. I am asking for your forgiveness, though I know I do not deserve it." Her heart, which had been encased in ice for so long, began to thaw. The tears she had refused to shed for weeks pricked at the back of her eyes. This was it. This was the man from the study. Not the Duke, but Alistair. The man who wrestled with numbers and responsibilities. The man who cared for his tenants. The man whose hand had felt so warm on hers. "And I am here," he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "to ask for more than that. I am asking you to come back. Not as a companion. Not as a guest." He paused, and the next words came with a wrenching difficulty, as if he were pulling them from the deepest part of his soul. "I am asking you to come back as my wife. No, not as my wife, as my partner. I cannot run Blackwood without you. The ledgers are a mess, the tenants are confused, and the house is just a pile of stones without you in it. I do not want a duchess. I want Alara. I want the woman who sees the error in the third column, the woman who understands the contours of the land, the woman who had the courage and integrity to turn her back on a duke because he was not man enough for her." He fell silent, his confession finished. He had laid his heart, his pride, and his title at her feet in this small, shabby room. He had offered her not a life of ease as a duchess, but a life of shared work as his partner. He was not offering to rescue her from her life. He was asking her to help him with his. She looked from his earnest, pleading face to the ink blot on her map. The stain was permanent. It had ruined the perfect, ordered world she had tried to create. But perhaps, she thought, a life without blots and stains, a life of perfect, sterile order, was not a life at all. Perhaps a true partnership was about helping each other clean up the messes. Slowly, she stood up. She walked around the drafting table until she was standing directly in front of him. She reached out and gently took the battered hat from his nerveless fingers, placing it on the table behind her. Then, she took his large, calloused hands in her own ink-stained ones. "Alistair," she said, her voice clear and strong, "I accept." He looked confused for a moment. "You accept my apology?" "Yes," she said, a slow smile spreading across her face, a smile he had seen only in fleeting glimpses in the study. "I accept your apology, and I accept your proposal, on one condition." A flicker of fear crossed his face. "Anything." "We must go back to the study," she said, her eyes twinkling with a light he had never seen before. "And we must start with the third column. It is a complete disaster." For the first time since she had met him, the Duke of Blackwood threw back his head and laughed. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated joy, a sound of profound relief, a sound that chased the last of the shadows from the small room and promised the beginning of a new, more honest accounting. The return to Blackwood Manor was nothing like her first arrival. There was no rain, only a crisp, brilliant winter sun that made the old stone of the house gleam. They arrived not in a grand carriage, but in the simple post-chaise Alistair had hired, and he helped her down himself, his hand warm and steady in hers. The staff, led by a beaming Mistress Hobbs, was assembled in the great hall, not out of formal duty, but out of what seemed to be genuine happiness. The house itself felt different, lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted from its ancient stones. It was breathing again. Their marriage was a quiet affair, held in the small family chapel on the estate, attended only by the tenants and the household staff. Alara wore her simple blue velvet dress, and Alistair wore not the formal attire of a duke, but a simple, well-cut suit. They exchanged vows not of property and title, but of partnership and mutual respect. It was a contract of the heart, witnessed by the people whose lives they had pledged to improve. The study, once their secret sanctuary, became the acknowledged center of their new life. The great oak desk was moved to one side, and a second, smaller one, a perfect match in dark, polished wood, was brought in and placed beside it. Here they spent their days, side by side, untangling the complicated knots of the estate. Their conversations were a comfortable mix of the practical and the personal, weaving from discussions of crop yields and tenant leases to shared stories of their childhoods, their dreams, and their fears. He learned the full story of her quiet, overlooked life, of her passion for the clean certainty of maps in a world that had always felt messy and unpredictable. She, in turn, finally understood the true depth of his grief, not just for his brother, but for the carefree young man he had been before the weight of the dukedom had descended upon him. In sharing their vulnerabilities, they forged a bond far stronger than any legal document. The transformation of the estate was slow but steady. Under Alara's careful management and Alistair's newfound energy, the ledgers balanced, the debts began to shrink, and the land began to prosper. The tenants, repaid with interest for the overcharged tithes, looked upon their new duchess not with the distant reverence reserved for a title, but with a deep, abiding respect for the woman who knew their fields and their families as well as they did themselves. She was not a lady who presided over tea tables. She was a partner who walked the fields after a rain, checking the drainage and listening to their concerns. One spring afternoon, a year after their wedding, Alara stood with Alistair on a hill overlooking the north fields. The land was a patchwork of vibrant green, the new crops pushing their way towards the sun. A group of children, the sons and daughters of the tenants she had first championed, were flying a kite in the breeze, their laughter carrying on the wind. Alistair came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "Do you remember the first day you came here?" he asked, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "The house was a tomb, and I was its chief ghost." "I remember a house that was sad," she replied, leaning back against the solid warmth of his chest, "and a man who was carrying too heavy a burden alone. And now?" She turned in his arms to face him, her hands coming up to frame his face. She looked into his eyes, no longer stormy and haunted, but clear and full of a quiet, steady love. Now, she said softly, I see a home, and a man who has learned that the greatest strength is not in standing alone, but in standing together. He lowered his head and kissed her, a long, slow kiss that tasted of sunshine and promises kept. It was not a kiss of frantic passion, but of deep, comfortable, and abiding love. It was the kiss of true partners who had found in each other not a solution to their problems, but a shared strength to face them. The worth of a person, she had learned, was not measured in the gifts they could give or the titles they could bestow, but in the simple, profound courage to show up, to be present, and to offer not their possessions, but their very self. And in the quiet, balanced ledger of their shared life, that was an asset beyond all accounting.